Some defendants walked into court believing the hardest part was already behind them. They smiled, they laughed, they appeared calm, convinced they could explain everything away. But confidence means very little when the evidence tells a different story. Surveillance footage, phone records, forensic evidence, and digital timelines began revealing facts that couldn't be ignored. In this compilation, we'll examine 4 true crime cases: Gregg, Mackenzie Shirilla, Trinity Poague, and Cydney Powell, where a confident expression in the courtroom lasted only until the evidence changed everything. She walked into a Mississippi courtroom wearing braces, dressed more like a student headed to class than a defendant facing life in prison. And then she smiled. It was not a wide smile, not the smile of victory, not the smile of someone mocking the court. It was brief, awkward, almost childlike. But that single expression would shape how millions of people saw Gregg. To some, it was proof she was cold and remorseless. To others, it looked like something else entirely. The confused reaction of a 14-year-old girl who could not fully understand that her childhood was ending in that room. Because hanging over Carly's head was a sentence no child should be able to comprehend: life without parole. So the real question was never just why she smiled. The real question was what was happening inside her mind. Was that the face of evil, or the face of a broken child standing in a place far beyond her emotional age? Gregg's story did not begin with gunshots. It began years earlier, inside a family marked by pain long before the crime ever happened. Her biological father, Gregg, reportedly struggled with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and addiction. Mental illness was not a distant medical term in Carly's life. It was part of her bloodline, part of her family history, part of the fear that quietly lived inside the home. Her mother, Ashley Smiley, reportedly worried that Carly might someday follow the same path. Imagine loving your child while also fearing what may already be growing inside them. That fear alone can reshape a family. Then there was another tragedy. When Carly was just 4 years old, she lost her younger sister, Natalie. Children often do not process grief the way adults do. They bury it, they carry it. They become older on the inside while still looking young on the outside. Some wounds never disappear. They simply wait. As Carly grew older, she seemed successful. She was bright, polite, capable, and often described as a good student. On the surface, she looked like the kind of teenager parents are proud to raise. But appearances can become prisons. People close to the case described an intense emotional bond between Carly and her mother. Carly reportedly felt responsible for Ashley's happiness. She wanted to be perfect. She feared disappointing her more than anything. That kind of pressure can crush a young mind. So Carly built 2 versions of herself. One was the smiling student, the capable daughter, the promising teenager. The other was hidden. Secret phones, substance use, emotional instability, self-harm, isolation. Behaviors that looked like rebellion to outsiders, but may have been desperation from the inside. Sometimes teenagers do not act out because they are bad. Sometimes they act out because they are drowning. Then came the journal. In private writings, Carly described hearing voices. She wrote about a friend in her head. She described feeling disconnected from reality. To prosecutors, those words could look manipulative. To others, they sounded like an alarm no one answered. Whether those writings reflected psychosis, emotional distress, or both, they revealed one undeniable truth: Carly was not okay. And then came what some believe was the turning point. Just 6 days before the killing, her medication was changed from Zoloft to Lexapro. For many patients, antidepressants can be life-saving. But in adolescents with unstable mental health or hidden bipolar tendencies, sudden medication changes can sometimes trigger severe reactions: agitation, mania, emotional numbness, dissociation, loss of control. No medication alone explains murder, but chemistry matters, especially in a brain still developing. So another question emerged. Did Carly act with full awareness? Or had she entered a mental state even she could not understand? Then came March 19th, 2024. Ashley reportedly learned more about Carly's hidden behavior and returned home deeply concerned. What happened next would destroy an entire family. Inside that house, Carly retrieved a handgun. Minutes later, Ashley Smiley was dead. When Heath Smiley returned home, he was also shot. But Heath survived, and what he said afterwards stunned many observers. He did not speak of Carly as a monster. He described her as a sweet girl. He said something was terribly wrong that day. Even more remarkable, reports later suggested Heath continued communicating with Carly and supported efforts seeking compassion and fairness for her future. That is difficult for many people to understand. But sometimes victims see pain more clearly than spectators do. Heath reportedly described Carly during the attack not as calculating, but panicked, screaming like an animal, not evil, broken. Then came the legal system. Before trial, Carly was reportedly offered a plea deal of 40 years in prison. She refused. Many adults would struggle to understand that decision. Yet society expected a 14-year-old to wait decades in prison against the risk of dying behind bars. Was that a rational gamble, or the judgment of a child who still believed adults would save her? Before trial, Carly was also held in isolation because minors charged as adults must be separated from adult inmates. That meant months alone, nearly all day, every day. For a mentally fragile teenager, isolation can worsen depression, anxiety, paranoia, and emotional collapse. Yet the system called it procedure. At trial, prosecutors argued Carly knew exactly what she was doing. They pointed to the gun, the timing, and her actions after the shooting. The defense argued something entirely different. They said Carly was mentally ill, unraveling, and incapable of understanding her actions in a legally meaningful way. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Then came the verdict: guilty, life in prison. Some called it justice. Others saw another damaged child being buried alive by a system built for adults. And even now, the battle is not over. Appeals have continued in Mississippi, with attorneys arguing that jurors were misled about parole possibilities and that critical mental health context was mishandled. Whether those appeals succeed remains uncertain. But the larger meaning of the Carly Gregg case is already clear. This was never only about murder. It was about inherited trauma, ignored warning signs, the danger of treating teenage suffering as misbehavior, and the uncomfortable truth that some children commit terrible acts while also needing profound help. People saw a smile in that courtroom and thought they understood everything. But sometimes a smile is not confidence. Sometimes it is confusion. Sometimes it is fear. And sometimes it is the final mask worn by a child whose mind collapsed long before anyone noticed. If you're fascinated by true crime, courtroom drama, and the hidden psychology behind shocking cases, subscribe to FemCrime Files today. Join our growing community and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. FemCrime Files, where every case reveals a deeper truth.
She looked straight at the judge, calm, composed, even slightly smiling, like she already knew how this would end, like she was going home. But then, the prosecutor pressed play, and in that moment, everything changed. Because what the courtroom was about to see wasn't just evidence. It was the truth she could never take back. This is the case of 17-year-old Mackenzie Shirilla, a teenager who turned her car into a weapon, killing 2 young men in a crash that prosecutors say was no accident. And what ultimately convicted her wasn't just science. It wasn't just witnesses. It was her own words. On July 31st, 2022, in a quiet suburb in Ohio, what should have been an ordinary night turned into a tragedy. Inside a Toyota Camry were 3 teenagers: Mackenzie Shirilla, behind the wheel, her boyfriend Dominic Russo, and their friend Davin Flanagan. Minutes later, that car would slam into a building at over 100 miles per hour. The impact was catastrophic. Dominic and Davin didn't survive. Mackenzie did, and at first, it looked like a tragic accident. Her defense team moved quickly. They painted a picture of a heartbroken teenage girl, traumatized, confused, unable to remember anything from that night. According to them, this wasn't murder. This was a terrible accident. Maybe she panicked. Maybe she lost control. Maybe someone grabbed the wheel. Reasonable doubt. That was the strategy. And for a moment, it seemed like it might work. But then came the evidence. Not speculation, not theory. Cold, hard data. Investigators pulled information from the car's black box. It showed something chilling. The accelerator was fully pressed. No braking. No attempt to stop. This wasn't loss of control. This was control, all the way to impact. And then came something even more damaging. Something Mackenzie never expected to be used against her. Just hours after the crash, while being treated at the hospital, she spoke to medical staff. Not knowing her words would be documented. Not thinking about lawyers. Not thinking about a trial. She said she wanted to die. And that it was her fault for killing her boyfriend. Let that sink in, because later, she would claim she remembered nothing. When that statement was read aloud in court, it hit differently. This wasn't months later. This wasn't rehearsed. This was raw, immediate, unfiltered, her own words, contradicting everything her defense would later argue. But prosecutors didn't stop there. They showed the jury another side of Mackenzie, one the defense didn't want anyone to see. Her social media, TikTok videos, posts made around the time her relationship was falling apart. One caption read, "I'm the one you die for." Another said, "I'm just one of those girls who can do a lot of drugs and not die." These weren't old posts from years ago. They were recent, and they painted a disturbing picture. Then came the threats. Weeks before the crash, Mackenzie had said something chilling. "I will crash this car right now." At the time, maybe it sounded like anger, emotion, something said in the heat of the moment. But after the crash, it sounded like a warning. Prosecutors laid it out clearly. This wasn't an accident. This was intentional. They argued that Mackenzie made threats, practiced the route, and then carried it out, turning a 3,500-pound vehicle into a weapon. Months later, she was arrested, charged with aggravated murder. 2 counts. When officers placed her in handcuffs, she remained calm, polite, almost detached, like someone who still believed she might walk away from this. In court, the defense held on to one key argument: memory loss. They insisted Mackenzie couldn't remember what happened, that without intent, there could be no murder. But prosecutors didn't need her memory. They had everything else: data, statements, behavior, a pattern. When it came time for sentencing, Mackenzie addressed the court. She apologized, said she was heartbroken, said she loved Dominic. But even then, she maintained the same claim: she didn't remember. And it wasn't intentional. Observers noticed something else. As the judge described the crime, Mackenzie shook her head, side to side, as if disagreeing. Even in that moment, she didn't fully accept what she had done. Then her mother spoke, calling it a tragic accident, saying her daughter would never recover. Even after everything, the data, the threats, the admissions, the family still framed it as something unintentional. And that's what made this case so powerful. The contrast. Hours after the crash, she said it was her fault. A year later, she said she couldn't remember. 2 completely different stories. Only one could be true. In the end, the court found her guilty. 2 counts of murder. The evidence was overwhelming. Not just what she did, but what she said, when she thought no one was listening. This case isn't just about a crash. It's about intent, about accountability, and about how the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how carefully someone tries to hide it. Because sometimes, the most damning evidence isn't what investigators find. It's what you say when you think no one is paying attention. If you want more true crime stories that go beyond headlines, stories that break down the psychology, the evidence, and the courtroom drama, subscribe to FemCrime Files. Because every case has a story, and some of them are more disturbing than you could ever imagine.
When Trinity Poague entered the courtroom, she did not look like someone accused in one of the most disturbing child abuse cases many people had ever heard. She appeared calm, confident, composed. To many observers, she still looked like the same young woman who had once been crowned Miss Donaldsonville. She was a successful nursing student. She earned strong grades. She received leadership scholarships. She appeared intelligent, ambitious, and destined for a bright future. On the surface, Trinity represented the image of achievement, but prosecutors argued that image concealed a much darker reality. The case would ultimately become a disturbing reminder that public appearances often reveal very little about what happens behind closed doors. Psychologists frequently discuss the concept of social masks, the carefully constructed versions of ourselves that we present to the world. Most people do this to some degree. We hide our frustrations, insecurities, and darker emotions while displaying our best qualities. The danger comes when the mask becomes so convincing that nobody notices what is happening underneath. According to prosecutors, that is exactly what happened here, because behind the crown, the academic success, and the carefully maintained image, investigators believed there was a growing resentment directed toward an innocent 18-month-old child named J.D. At the center of the prosecution's case was a form of jealousy that went far beyond ordinary relationship insecurity. Evidence presented during trial suggested Trinity struggled with one fact she could never change. Her boyfriend already had a child. To most people, J.D. was simply a toddler. To prosecutors, J.D. became the symbol of everything Trinity could never erase. Text messages recovered during the investigation revealed troubling insight into her mindset. One message in particular captured investigators' attention. "I don't want to be the mother of the second child. I want to be the first." Those words would later take on enormous significance because they suggested that J.D. was not merely viewed as a child. He was viewed as a reminder that another woman came before her, a reminder that she would never occupy the unique position she desired in her boyfriend's life. For many people, a partner's past relationships are simply part of reality, but prosecutors argued that Trinity viewed J.D. differently. In her mind, the child represented competition, not for attention, not for affection, but for status, for importance, for being first. As investigators reviewed additional messages, an increasingly disturbing pattern emerged. The language became more hostile, more resentful, more aggressive. What shocked many observers was the contrast between Trinity's public image and her private conversations. Here was a nursing student, a person preparing for a career centered on compassion and care. Yet, prosecutors presented messages in which she complained repeatedly about caring for J.D. She described feeling trapped, stuck, burdened. According to testimony, some messages even contained violent remarks about the child. Jurors were asked to consider an uncomfortable question. Which version of Trinity was real? The accomplished student admired by teachers and classmates, or the person revealed through private conversations? The prosecution argued that the answer became clear on the day everything changed. The timeline was one of the most powerful parts of the case. It was also one of the simplest. At approximately 11:55 a.m., J.D.'s father left the residence. Surveillance footage showed J.D. alive, active, and healthy. The toddler waved goodbye. There appeared to be nothing unusual, nothing alarming, nothing that suggested tragedy was only minutes away. For the next 35 minutes, J.D. remained alone with Trinity. Then, at approximately 12:30 p.m., his father returned. Everything had changed. The child was unresponsive. The happy toddler seen on surveillance footage only minutes earlier was now suffering catastrophic injuries. For prosecutors, the significance of that timeline was impossible to ignore. The child was healthy before being left alone with Trinity. Moments later, he was dying. The defense offered alternative explanations, but prosecutors argued that science would ultimately destroy those theories. Medical experts delivered some of the most devastating testimony in the trial. Doctors described injuries so severe that experienced professionals struggled to explain how anyone could view them as accidental. The injuries included extensive skull fractures, severe brain trauma, a lacerated liver, and patterned bruising on the child's face. One expert testified that the facial injuries were consistent with significant force. Another explained that the skull damage was so extensive that parts of the skull had separated at the sutures. The medical evidence painted a horrifying picture. Perhaps the most important testimony concerned the timing of the injuries. The defense suggested that JD may have suffered an earlier accident and remained active afterward. Medical experts strongly disagreed. Doctors testified that a child sustaining injuries of this magnitude would not simply continue playing, eating, or behaving normally. One physician stated there was effectively zero chance that JD could have appeared healthy and active after receiving such catastrophic trauma. That testimony struck at the heart of the defense theory. Because surveillance footage had already shown JD acting normally shortly before he was left alone with Trinity, if the injuries had already occurred, medical experts said the child could not have behaved that way. The science and the timeline appeared to tell the same story, but prosecutors were not finished. One of the most damaging pieces of evidence came not from the crime scene, not from doctors, not from surveillance footage. It came from Trinity's own phone. Investigators discovered internet searches conducted while JD was suffering from his injuries. The searches included questions such as how to recognize a brain bleed and whether skull fractures could go unnoticed. For prosecutors, these searches revealed something deeply troubling. They did not reflect panic. They reflected awareness. Someone experiencing a genuine accident would be expected to seek emergency medical assistance immediately. Instead, prosecutors argued that the searches demonstrated a conscious effort to understand the consequences of severe injuries. The timing made those searches especially powerful, because while a child was allegedly fighting for his life, Trinity appeared to be researching the very injuries later identified by doctors. The prosecution argued that this was not evidence of confusion. It was evidence of knowledge. As the investigation continued, another problem emerged for the defense. Trinity's explanations kept changing. Investigators testified that her account evolved repeatedly as new evidence surfaced. One version suggested an accident. Another pointed toward a fall from a bed. Later explanations introduced different details. Each time, prosecutors argued, the pattern remained the same. The story changed. The evidence did not. The surveillance footage remained unchanged. The medical findings remained unchanged. The search history remained unchanged. As contradictions accumulated, prosecutors argued that the shifting explanations represented attempts to fit a story around evidence that could not be explained away. Jurors listened as investigators described multiple versions of events. 5 different explanations, 5 different efforts to account for injuries that doctors insisted were not consistent with ordinary accidents. The more evidence emerged, the narrower Trinity's options became. Eventually, the carefully maintained image that had defined her public life began to collapse under the weight of objective evidence. Then came the verdict. For months, attention had focused on whether prosecutors could prove the most serious charge. When jurors announced their decision regarding malice murder, Trinity appeared overwhelmed with emotion. For a brief moment, there seemed to be relief, but that moment did not last, because the jury also returned guilty verdicts on multiple other felony charges connected to JD's death. The courtroom atmosphere shifted immediately. What had seemed like a partial victory became something entirely different. The legal distinction mattered, but the practical outcome remained devastating. As the judge addressed the courtroom, he spoke about the tragedy that had affected everyone involved. A child was gone, a family was shattered, lives had been permanently altered. There were no winners, only loss. Yet perhaps the most heartbreaking image emerged not from the courtroom, but from JD's father. According to testimony and statements presented during the case, he kept one of his son's jackets unwashed after the child's death. The reason was simple: it still carried JD's scent. For grieving parents, small objects often become priceless connections to the people they have lost. A toy, a photograph, a piece of clothing, something ordinary transformed into something irreplaceable. In the end, that jacket symbolized what this case was truly about. Not pageants, not titles, not courtroom arguments, not internet searches, not legal theories. A little boy who never had the chance to grow up. The story of Trinity Poague serves as a reminder that appearances can be dangerously misleading. Success does not guarantee character. Achievement does not guarantee compassion. And public admiration does not reveal private truth. The Crown may have projected perfection, but the evidence presented in court told a very different story. One in which jealousy became resentment. Resentment became hostility. And hostility, prosecutors argued, ultimately ended in tragedy. For many people, the most lasting lesson is not about the verdict itself. It is about the warning signs, the private anger, the escalating hostility, the belief that another human being is an obstacle rather than a person. Because sometimes, the most dangerous masks are the ones that look the most beautiful. And sometimes, the truth does not emerge until the mask finally breaks. There are some smiles that make people uncomfortable. Not because they look evil, but because they look empty. In a Summit County courtroom, 23-year-old Cydney Powell sat quietly beside her attorneys while cameras focused on her expression. At moments, she appeared emotionless. At others, she smiled faintly at inappropriate times. To many watching the trial, it looked chilling, like the face of someone completely detached from the horror she had caused. But inside the courtroom, another explanation emerged. By the time the trial began, Cydney had already been diagnosed with schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder. She was heavily medicated with antipsychotic drugs like Abilify and anti-anxiety medication, including Ativan. Doctors testified that the medication often flattened emotional responses, distorted facial expression, and created what psychiatrists call a blunted affect. So what exactly were people seeing? Was that smile proof of a cold-blooded killer? Or was it the final visible crack in a mind that had already collapsed long before the murder ever happened? That question would divide an entire courtroom. Because this case was never just about a daughter killing her mother, it became a battle over something much darker, the terrifying moment when reality itself begins to break apart. Before her death, Brenda Powell spent nearly 3 decades helping children and families survive some of the worst moments imaginable. She worked at Akron Children's Hospital as a child life specialist in the hematology-oncology unit, guiding seriously ill children through fear, pain, and grief. Friends described her as patient, warm, and emotionally intelligent. Ironically, the woman who helped strangers navigate emotional trauma could not see the darkness quietly growing inside her own daughter. People close to the family described Brenda and Cydney as inseparable. They were more than mother and daughter. They were best friends. Steve Powell, Cydney's father, would later describe their bond as unbreakable. And maybe that is what makes the story so disturbing. Nothing about Cydney Powell looked dangerous from the outside. She had been an honors student, a scholarship athlete, a teenager who played soccer and lacrosse. Teachers described her as bright and kind. She earned a presidential scholarship to the University of Mount Union and seemed to have a future filled with opportunity. But somewhere beneath that image, something had already begun to fracture. Years before the murder, Cydney suffered multiple concussions while playing soccer. Defense experts later argued that repeated head trauma may have affected her neurological development and increased vulnerability to severe mental illness. At college, her behavior slowly changed. She became withdrawn, anxious, exhausted all the time. Some days, she reportedly slept up to 16 hours. Friends noticed panic attacks and emotional instability. Professors noticed she was disappearing academically. But the most disturbing part was not the failure itself. It was what happened after. Instead of accepting reality, Cydney appeared to create a new one. When she was academically suspended from Mount Union, she never told her parents. She continued carrying her backpack around campus. She pretended to attend classes she was no longer enrolled in. She wandered through locked university buildings. She maintained conversations about homework and assignments that no longer existed. For months, she performed an entire fake life. The prosecution called it manipulation. The defense called it psychological collapse. Because according to multiple psychiatric experts, Cydney wasn't simply lying to others anymore. She may have been lying to herself. And eventually, that false reality became impossible to maintain. On March 3, 2020, everything finally began falling apart. Steve Powell discovered that his daughter was no longer enrolled in school. Brenda started calling university administrators, trying to understand what was happening. Hours later, she returned home to speak with Cydney face to face. According to testimony, before the violence erupted, Brenda sat beside her daughter on the couch and tried to comfort her. She hugged her. She reportedly told her, "Everything is going to be okay." The defense would later argue that this moment mattered more than anyone realized, because for months, Cydney had built her entire identity around avoiding failure, avoiding humiliation, avoiding the truth. And suddenly, the one person whose opinion mattered most finally knew everything. Psychiatrists described what may have happened next as an acute psychotic break, a total collapse of the false reality she had spent months trying to preserve. During a phone call with university officials, loud, banging noises suddenly erupted through the speaker. Then came screams. According to investigators, Cydney attacked her mother with a cast iron skillet before stabbing her repeatedly. Brenda suffered more than 30 stab wounds. The brutality shocked even veteran investigators. But strangely, the defense argued that the violence itself supported the insanity claim, because in their words, this level of overkill screams psychosis. Then came the moment that changed the entire trial. After the attack, university officials repeatedly called Brenda's phone back. On the third attempt, someone answered. Yes, this is Brenda. But it wasn't Brenda. It was Cydney, pretending to be her mother. That single sentence became the emotional center of the case. For prosecutors, it proved consciousness of guilt. They argued that someone capable of impersonating the victim immediately after the murder clearly understood right from wrong. But defense experts saw something entirely different. They argued Cydney was desperately trying to preserve the false reality she had been living in for months, a confused psychological attempt to stop reality from crashing down completely. Not calculation, delusion. The jury had to decide which explanation made more sense. And maybe that is why this case became so emotionally divisive, because even after Brenda died, her own family did not want Cydney treated like a monster. Steve Powell begged prosecutors not to pursue the case aggressively. Brenda's mother did the same. They believed Cydney needed psychiatric treatment more than punishment. While awaiting trial, Cydney reportedly improved dramatically once stabilized on medication. Family members described her as calmer, clearer, and emotionally present again. But prosecutors insisted that mental illness alone could not erase responsibility. And after years of delays, the case finally went to trial in 2023. The courtroom became a war between psychiatry and criminal law. 3 defense experts concluded that Cydney was experiencing severe psychosis during the murder and could not fully understand the wrongfulness of her actions. The state's expert disagreed. She argued that Cydney showed signs of anxiety and personality disorder traits, but not insanity. More importantly, she claimed the elaborate deception before and after the murder demonstrated awareness, planning, and self-preservation. In September 2023, the jury found Cydney Powell guilty. She was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. But the story didn't end there. In a shocking legal twist, an appeals court later overturned the conviction, not because Cydney was declared innocent, but because the trial judge had denied the defense the opportunity to present a rebuttal witness after the prosecution's expert challenged their psychiatric methodology during testimony. Now the case sits before the Ohio Supreme Court, raising larger questions about how the justice system handles defendants suffering from severe mental illness. And maybe that is the most disturbing part of all. Not the violence, not the lies, but the uncertainty. Because society feels comfortable judging evil. Evil is simple. Evil is easier to punish. Mental illness is not. What happens when someone commits an unimaginable crime while their mind is collapsing underneath them? What if they truly cannot separate reality from delusion? Should prison become punishment or treatment? Even today, those questions remain unanswered. After the murder, while sitting inside a psychiatric hospital, Cydney reportedly muttered the same phrase over and over again: "Get out." According to medical staff, she claimed she could not remember killing her mother. Maybe she was lying. Maybe she wasn't. And somewhere between those two possibilities lies the terrifying heart of this entire case.